Hello and welcome to my channel. What we're going to be talking about today is how the world you see is not the real world around you, but is actually a set of narratives and ideologies and stories about the world that were put into your head by someone else, and they've been pulling you around like a puppet. Stay tuned, we're about to get into it. So I just said you're being pulled around by all these things that have infected your mind that you're unaware of. So what do I mean by that? I mean, come on, this is crazy stuff. Well, you've heard a lot online of people talk about the Matrix. They talk about, sometimes you may have heard it referred to as the red pill. And this isn't a political statement. It's not something that's related to any group of political camps. In fact, it's actually something much, much deeper than that. The idea here is that the reality that was around you, everything that we see, is structured by the way that our brains have evolved and adapted to perceive the world, right? So when I'm sitting here on this bench at the park, and when I approached this bench, when I walked up here, I didn't see anything that was resembling the actual shape of this structure, right? I see the bench itself as an object. One sec. Sorry, we had to put it on pause here. Someone was running past. All right, so back to what I was saying. So when humans are walking around in the world, we don't actually see the world. What we see is we see things that are useful to us. We evolved to only see things that matter. And so we don't see, for example, every spectrum of light possible. We don't see UV light. We don't see infrared light. And that's because those spectrums of light in our evolutionary past were not necessary. There are other creatures, like birds and so forth, that can pick up on light spectrums that we can't perceive. The same thing with sound, and the same thing with any number of other things that are possible, right? So when we talk about the Matrix, we're not talking about some abstract thing or some fringe, weird area of politics or some sort of accelerationist thing. All we're talking about is the fact that human beings are necessarily constrained in the amount of information that they can process. And because of those constraints, and because of the fact that we evolved inside of a particular environmental niche, and also throughout our lifetime have learned things that have shaped our perception even further, we're limited in terms of what we can see. All right, so looking all around me, you see all these things growing everywhere, right? And everywhere that we know of, there's things growing and things adapting to different niches. And the saying in evolutionary biology is that every niche will be filled, right? And this is similar to the idea of, life finds a way. And the idea behind this is basically there's an innate intelligence, or there's an innate will in all living organisms to find a way to keep surviving and reproducing itself, right? Survival and reproduction. And the same thing goes for not just living organisms, but also more abstract concepts like ideas. What do I mean by this? Well, Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, talks about evolutionary biology and the fact that genes over time drive a lot of human behavior. And in fact, the human body itself and humans in general are sort of just vessels for these things called genes that go on well long after us, and they were here around before us. And they, in some sense, exist independent of us. They're sort of just using our body for a temporary period of time as a vessel to reproduce and move forward into the future. And once the body has been used, it's no longer useful anymore, and so it can just discard it. Hi, someone's running past. And so this simple fact means, and what is the gene? The gene isn't the body, right? The gene is not the human being itself. I carry a bunch of genes in me. I have a genetic twin, an identical twin, for example, who has the same exact genetics as I do, and he's carrying the same exact genes. So what is the gene then, if it's not the organism itself? Well, the gene is obviously just the DNA. It's the way that the information is structured. And so this bit of information reproduces itself and has the characteristic of immortality, if you consider the fact that all human beings evolved from the same original human, the universal, the so-called universal common ancestor. And going back even further, we go back to the smallest possible life forms and microorganisms. At some point we came from that. And so what that means is that these structures that organize information are actually, they go on much longer than us, and they control all of our behavior, because everything that we do while we're alive is basically in service of this gene. So in getting back to Richard Dawkins, in The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins talks about this concept of applying evolution to the realm of ideas, okay? And he calls this, as everybody now knows on the internet, this is memes, right? So the idea is that there are essentially ideas in the world, and what they do is they go around and they exist independent of any particular individual or being. Obviously, human beings can spread ideas, and they can be the progenitor of ideas. But once you release the idea into the world, it's not really your idea anymore. And the idea, insofar as it exists, only exists in the heads of the people who have that idea. And so it's very, very similar to an organism in this way, in that it reproduces itself. It exists inside of the host, or the body, in our case, your mind. And it only has an interest in keeping itself going, right? And the crucial insight of narrowing in on this meme concept is that all of our thoughts about politics, all of our thoughts about culture, about religion, basically huge chunks of what you think of as your identity is in fact a bunch of collected narratives that form some kind of meme or collection of memes, also called a memeplex or a meme complex. And this is what's guiding your world. So let me just give you a more concrete example and get a little bit out of the abstract. People ask this question all the time. Why do I have to take the whole basket in politics? Why, if I say that I'm a Democrat, do I necessarily then believe both in increased taxes and, let's say, being pro-choice? Right? Why are those things necessarily coordinated? There's no clear reason in logic or economics why the tax rate would have anything to do necessarily with reproductive rights or abortion. And people ask the same thing on the Republican side. Why is it that if I'm pro-gun, that means that I also I don't know. You're pro-gun, and you're also in favor of shrinking the federal government, for example. Those don't necessarily need to be in the same basket, even though a lot of people maybe libertarians and things like that would argue that. And you might say, well, if you have guns, you're sort of implicitly taking power away from the government, and yada yada yada. But there's no clear reason at all necessarily why those ideas need to be correlated. And the reason is because these ideas have all become part of a package deal, right? So we have a two-party system in the case of the United States, and it's sort of game theoretically locked in that way. And so because of that, because of the dynamics that there can only be two, you have to cram a bunch of sort of only mildly correlated or in some cases totally unrelated issues into one of those two molds, right? You can only get your issue focused on if one of the two major parties, Republicans or Democrats, decide that they care enough to pick it up and to do work for it. And if you're not really if you don't really have advocates on either of those sides, then you're not really in the political conversation. You're not really in the Overton window. Your issue or idea is basically irrelevant. So, okay, so we've got these packages, and this is just to illustrate the idea, right? And so you say, well, I want to be part of a group. I want to have power, and the way that I do that is by being a conduit of one of these two parties. All right, so you pick up one of these packages, which I'm just going to call for right now an operating system. It's an ideological operating system. It's a prepackaged set of instructions or ways to view the world, and it's a lens that someone can sort of hand you and say, here, look through this. And then the way that you can think about political ideologies in general working is that you have a frame that you're born with, or that you're gifted from your culture, from your family, whatever it may be, from your school in many cases, and you adjust it to see what kind of picture of the world it gives you, right? And as you get older and you go through life and you progress, you maybe get introduced to different kinds of lenses and different kinds of frames. And so you see that when you try on different things, you can actually see the world differently, and you're going to get different things out of it. Different ways of perceiving the world are going to give you different outcomes given the same data, the same information. You're going to draw different conclusions. And hold on, someone passing real quick. All right, we're back. So you get one of these prepackaged ideas, and then that becomes your way of looking at the world. And you get a tribe that's associated with that, and you get all kinds of benefits of association with that label, right? And you can do this with anything. You can do it with libertarianism, you can do it with communism, you can do it with Marxism. It doesn't matter. But the idea is the same. What you're getting is a set of ideas, or a memeplex, that has an interest in continuing itself, right? And just like the gene, just like the selfish gene that Richard Dawkins brought up, it doesn't necessarily have your interest in mind, okay? So there's no reason at all for the memes that propagate, the memes that do well, that are successful, to necessarily be good for their hosts, right? And this is a contentious point. This is a point made by, for example, Richard Dawkins. When he refers to religion, he's often calling it a parasite for this reason. The implication being that religion itself is a set of ideas that's fundamentally parasitic on its host. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. As you know, I follow Brett Weinstein, and he has a different take on this. He's an evolutionary biologist as well. And his take is that there is some sort of benefit to it, but either way, it's a contentious issue. So here's the deal. The ideas themselves don't necessarily have the best human interest in mind. And just like a virus in real life, as long as it can continue to propagate to new hosts at a faster rate than it can be extinguished, or than it can extinguish its own hosts, then it can just keep going. Okay, so there's not necessarily a reason for the virus to be good for you, or for the memes that you have to be good for you. Okay, and this gets to the next part of the series, the next part of this argument, which we'll get into the next video, just because I'm running out of battery here, and running out of time. It's sun's going up here in the park, so it's getting pretty hot. And this last point is really, really crucial to think about. And like I said, it's going to be a big bomb, but like and subscribe, hit the alert notifications, and get the bell on the next video. And you'll be able to see the second half of this argument here, which will be coming out in a few days. But the real bombshell here is there's no reason to believe that the memes that you have are serving you the best. And if you want to improve your life, if you want to get drastically different results, one trick that you can do, and it's kind of like magic, is simply change the lenses